Let's talk about the bogus Second Amendment. And no, I am not coming out as an anti-Second Amender. I love the Second Amendment. If I was living in America, I'd be the first one going to the gun range, getting all sorts of goodies and gear and other things that I can have a lot of fun with. But there are some people who really hate the Second Amendment. We know this. Everybody on the left wing in the Democrats in America has been going on for ages about how the Second Amendment causes lots of violence. It causes... The Second
Amendment causes violence because before the Second Amendment, there was no violence.
Exactly.
It was like the Garden of Eden.
I'm glad you know your history, Carl.
I do.
The Second Amendment forces people
Crusaders
to go out.
going around with shotguns.
What you do is you buy the gun and the gun whispers in your ear, you should shoot that man. You should shoot that man. And there's another lie. There's a new lie going around about the Second Amendment that isn't actually new. I found out in researching for this. It's just an old lie that has resurfaced and is becoming popular again because they all are. Time is a flat circle. Nothing is new under the sun. But before I get into it, we've got a recent Contemplations from Josh where he's talking to Stelios about whether cities are the problem.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
that's a good subject.
That's my answer, at least. They seem to come to certain conclusions about the fact that in the city you've got anonymity, there's a greater separation between individuals, and that greater separation and anonymity means you don't have to be nice to each other. At the end of the day, you just don't have to be nice to each other in the city.
I agree.
I've been to London, which is a city, and
a dystopian city.
Well, it's kind of its own nation at this point, its own disturbing nation.
The city-state of London.
And you just walk down the street and people will just shout at each other for no particular reason, just because they've slighted one another. Whereas if you were in a smaller community, you would probably know this person and you would not feel as comfortable just yelling at them in the street.
I don't know. If I knew someone, "Oi, Frank,
Give
back my ruler that you stole 15 years ago."
Yeah, but then old Meredith would be walking past and she would give you
leave Frank alone.
Yeah, she would give you the side eye and then you'd feel bad about it for the next week. Whereas in the city, you don't get these things. So please check that out. It's £5.
You get stabbed.
£5 a month for a bronze membership, and you can go higher than that, but if you just want access to the content, £5 a month, and you'll be able to get access to all of Josh's contemplations, all of my work that I've done, all of Carl's work that he's done. So it's really a very small investment that we do
actually
have
a massive library of stuff.
We have a ridiculous library at this point. Even just Josh, he's 121 episodes into Contemplations. That's
amazing.
Actually. Yeah, that's pretty great. And that's over 100 hours of just Josh talking about interesting subjects.
And he recently won a poll of most people. Did he win the poll?
I think Brokenomics came out of nowhere and just overtook him. It was quite the shocker.
Yeah, but he's a very popular series. But anyway.
Yes. Anyway, let's move on to it. So this clip is one that I saw spreading around where people were just talking about how this person, Brant Robinson, was lying.
Really? I left this one on the internet and just lied.
I know. If you could just hover over his name for a second so we can see his bio. He's not got pronouns, but he's Carol's partner. So he defines himself as being his...
secondary to someone else.
Secondary to his woman. He's a Florida history teacher and rock climber, defender of public education, probable cuckold. That's the vibe that I'm getting from this. And his statement here, his statement here, I've got a good radar for these things. His statement here is, did you know the Second Amendment was added to our Bill of Rights to appease slave owners who needed to quickly arm militias to put down slave uprisings and insurrections? Why is this history not taught?
Well, that's not true.
Well, it might not be true, but listen to the conviction with which he says it. So let's play the clip so we can get the full context for this.
Good afternoon. Thank you as always for your kindness and for your insights. Do you know the relationship between slavery and the Second Amendment? Did you know that when the Second Amendment was added in 1791 as part of our Bill of Rights, the reason it was added to our Constitution was to satisfy slave states so they could quickly arm militias in case of the threat of slave uprisings and slave revolts. That's why the Second Amendment begins a well-regulated militia. But let's remember, the British established 13 colonies in North America, and all 13 of those colonies practiced slavery. And slavery with cash crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and of course, sugar down in the Caribbean was essential to the growing British Empire. That's why it was mandated that every colonial legislature made sure they paid for and maintained a colonial militia. And of course, that was only intensified by slave uprisings like the 1739 Stony Rebellion in South Carolina, and then another uprising in New York in 1741. But of course, after America became a country in our Revolutionary War, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there were compromises reached over slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise, expanding the slave trade for 20 more years, and a fugitive slave law that was added to the Constitution. That's why the Second Amendment was added, because when the Constitution was created, and everybody nod with me, the federal government now had precedence and power over state militias. But Southerners objected. They especially objected to the fact that they needed to quickly arm their militias to put down slave revolts. And that was only intensified the fact that in 1791, there was a major slave uprising in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And that slave uprising would eventually lead to the creation of the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, a black nation called Haiti. And when that uprising began, it sent shockwaves through the American South. So that's why the Second Amendment was added to our Constitution, so that Southern slave states could quickly arm militias and put down slave revolts and insurrections. My friends, our history matters. You guys be well and have a great start to your Friday.
That is totally ahistorical.
History. History teacher. This man is teaching children history.
Well, that's not true.
No.
I mean, it's such a liberal perspective that every man should be armed.
I love the timeline as well going on here. They came up with the Second Amendment before the Haitian Uprising, but the Haitian Uprising specifically influenced it. There's a few contradictions.
Yeah. But it's
here.
It's an expressly liberal thing, because Locke is unbelievably clear about this. He's like, look, if you're wandering around and some guy says, right, give me your wallet, you don't know what his intentions are because he's already abandoned the rule of law. And so you're completely...
He could just take your wallet and kill you anyway.
Exactly. So you're completely within your right to do anything you can to keep yourself from out of his power, including to the point of killing him. And that was a deeply held liberal belief.
And this is one of the reasons
obviously influenced the founding fathers.
This is one of the reasons that red states have like castle doctrine, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if someone has invaded your home, well, that's your home, that's your property.
Yes.
Who knows what else he's going to do once he's in there? You have the right to take him out if you need to.
Yeah.
And that's why there's stand the ground laws. There's so much...
I mean, this is an old English feeling about how self-defense should operate.
Yes, it exists long before America. But no,
but also,
according to liberal Floridian teachers, Ron, you need to get on this.
But also in the context of, say, the American Revolution, it's clear that the well-regulated militia is to resist, frankly, the British coming back with the regulars. And
I mean, we did come back and burn down the White House at one point. So it's not like they weren't founded with their concerns.
Well, exactly. It's not like it was an unfounded concern. But there were also, and what I love about that is that he talks as if, like, America exists, it pops into existence in a vacuum, as if there weren't the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, other colonial empires who you may have to have a militia against. I mean, it's not like the Americans and the Spanish hadn't fought wars or anything, right? Like, and the Mexicans as well. Like, you need the ability to defend your country. That was what the Americans, that's what the Second Amendment's about.
He does also try and reframe it.
And prevent from government tyranny. Like, sorry, there are so many other reasons slave patrols.
There are so many problems with this. Notwithstanding, just the words that the founders said.
Well, yeah, there are the express words as well. Yeah.
If we just scroll down so we can get a better image of this, somebody underneath that just shared this at him. The Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. George Washington, a free people ought not only be armed and disciplined, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government.
Yes.
No mention of slaves.
This is just such an English ethos as well.
It just makes sense to me. And this is why England is such a shadow. One of the reasons England is a shadow of its former self. Because you can get arrested now for defending yourself if somebody's broken into your house. Yeah. Like there was an old man who, somebody broke into his flat. He stabbed the person.
With a screwdriver. I remember this one.
Yeah, and got arrested for it.
Yeah. He, after enough public outrage, he was let go.
Only after the public outrage.
Exactly. Only after the public outrage. And the thing is, though, like, I'm just like, the more I've been reading and researching about this, the more I've come to the conclusion that essentially an Englishman isn't an Englishman unless he's armed. And it's actually kind of harrowing that none of us are allowed to be armed.
Oh, it is.
But anyway.
I've got an article talking about it that you can also find on the website about how England lost its rights to self-defense. Just one step at a time. One step at a time. It's just, somebody comes out and says, well, we could be a bit safer if we just regulate this kind of ammunition, then it regulate this kind of barrel, and then all of a sudden by the 90s, they're just coming outright for pistols and anything else that the public can own. And that's happened. We also have the words of Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, which were pretty explicit, where he just says, if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. Yeah. I don't notice any mention of slavery there, but this man who shared this initial video has an excellent rebuttal to our arguments, which is...
Did he block you?
No, I don't interact with these people on Twitter, thankfully. But he just said, well, that's not what the Second Amendment says, though. He just goes, those on your circled section is not part of the Second Amendment. Yeah, but neither's the part about slavery, though.
Yeah, but this is famous, and honestly, there's a part of it that's kind of beautiful in its simplicity, because I love the phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's very clear.
It might as well end with simple as.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Shall not be infringed is a great phrase, because it's literally almost immune to being perverted. Right? Anything that infringes my ability to own a gun is unconstitutional.
I mean, they try and nitpick it all the time, but at the end of the day, it's very simple what it means. But
also, just another quick thing here, being necessary to the security of a free state, right? Now, you go back 300 years, and you'll remember, for Mr. Brant Robinson here, that in fact, large numbers of people were invading each other all the time. It was quite possible that 100,000 men would march from, say, France into Germany at the head of some Corsican and start knocking out cities and knocking out governments. Like, you actually needed to be able to raise a large number of armed men in order to save your country from invasion. And it's happened a lot in the pre-modern era.
This is even just small-scale stuff, because, for instance, in England, you know, the northernmost parts of England, right south of Hadrian's Wall, there were the Reivers and such, and you would just go across the border, you would try and take out some of their village and steal some of their stuff and women, they would try and do the same to you. So you would need to just have weapons. And all of this is not to mention the fact that a lot of America is very rural, and there are things like bears that you can't just get into a fist fight with a bear.
But even then, that's not mentioned in the Second Amendment. No, it's explicitly to protect the integrity of a free state from not only outside invasion, but also the government. Not because of slave uprisings. And if that's what they'd wanted, they would have just said it.
But
they would have said it.
The history teacher did read it in NPR, though. He did read it in NPR, which is
public funded,
state affiliated media.
69% public funded,
if I remember correctly. CBS. But that's the rubber stamp of approval for all good historians, is they get all of their information from NPR. Because this is somebody was responding to him. He responded with this as evidence. So I just decided to track down the article.
Yeah.
Okay. What is it that it says in here? And it's obviously a very impartial article, because the first line it opens with is, "Do black people have full Second Amendment rights?" ? And it opens with this lovely image of soldiers pointing guns at protesters who are all black. They fail to include very similar images that I've seen of these sorts of National Guards doing the same thing to white people as well, after the end of segregation of schools and such, to force them to desegregate, etc., etc. So that's interesting. And they say the question of whether black people have Second Amendment rights was the question asked by historian Carol Anderson, and she set out to answer it after Minnesota police killed Philando Castile, a black man with license to carry a gun, during a 2016 traffic stop.
I've heard the name before. Is it as they're describing? I don't know who Philando is.
I'll go with her description, and I'll take it at face value, because it says, "Here was a black man who was pulled over by the police, and the police officer asked to see his identification. Philando Castile, using NRA guidelines, alerts the officer that he has a licensed weapon with him, and the police officer began shooting." Now, if that is the true context of that situation, and when it comes to lefty historians, I find it very difficult to trust anything they say. But if that is the context, there's obviously no excuse for such a thing. Sure. It does not necessarily mean that the Second Amendment is automatically evil or was come up with by slave owners and should be repealed immediately. And I'm sorry, even if it was come up with purely so that slave owners would be able to own guns, and I don't see why they wouldn't have been able to own guns anyway and just hire a private force or something. But even so, even if it was, it still has nothing to do with modern applications of it as a way for people to arm themselves for self-defense. So it still doesn't have any relevance to problems that go on in cities and across America in the modern day. But anyway.
And another thing as well, right? If you look at, like, say, the murder hotspots in Chicago or LA.
Oh, we'll get onto that.
Lots of licensed guns there, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it carries on and says, in her new book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, a very, once again, impartial historian we're referring to here, Anderson traces racial distinctions in America's treatment of gun ownership back to the founding of the country and the Second Amendment. Because that's where it all started. I'm sure if you were to trace it back a bit further, it would get bang on to 1619. Because anything that happened, according to these people, according to leftist historians, anything that happened before MLK and civil rights in America was directly the result of either racism or pre-Civil War slavery. These are the two things it always just comes back to. Like you say, there's no context. No. All of these things just happened in a vacuum where people were just racist for no reason. They all just decided they hated each other.
Just racists in a vacuum obsessing over black people.
Yeah, because that makes sense, doesn't it? The language of the amendment, Anderson says, was crafted to ensure that slave owners could quickly crush any rebellion or resistance from those. But the thing is, we've just looked at the language of the amendment.
It doesn't
mention anything. The response to concerns coming out of the Virginia Ratification Convention, she just goes through the same bogus nonsense that he went through. So you can read the article for yourself. I wouldn't recommend it. It's just obvious propaganda and lies. Other people then started spreading this lie again using different sources. Now, this man,
Joy Reid.
Yeah, Joy Reid, another impartial interlocutor.
Joy, the honest Reid.
She's just an objective observer looking at things as she sees them from the sidelines. So this was Reverend Mark Thompson on MSNBC saying, these were white children killed because of an obsolete amendment. The Second Amendment was meant to prevent slave insurrection and slave rebellions. That is why there was no individual right. That's
just not true.
That's not true. But also, instead of going for Carol Anderson, he I still can't believe this. He quotes a different historian on this. He sources a different one. For the book Hidden History of the Second Amendment by a Professor Carl T. Bogus. A Professor Bogus wrote a book that said the Second Amendment was racism, and this man went, seems good to me. I mean, that's life is but a meme.
Yeah, that's very amusing.
That's great. And I found this article refuting Mr. Bogus. Talking about
like anyone with any passing familiarity with the Federalist Papers would know.
Yes, but there's even more, because it goes into the logic given in his articles, because he's also got a new book out recently called Madison's Militia, The Hidden History of the Second Amendment. So there's all hidden history of the Second Amendment. His original one came out in 1998. This is the new one that's come out this year. So it's partially promoting a book, which is why part of this discourse has started again. But they say in this article from the Independent Institute, it adds nothing new on his original points. He states up front that he will not address how legal scholars or the courts have interpreted the amendment, except to assert without any support that James Madison and his colleagues would have been astonished at the Supreme Court's holding that the amendment grants individuals a right to have guns. I don't think they would. But Bogus calls his tome a mystery book. The mystery, I presume, is finding the actual history in it. But anyway, it's...
James Madison would be astonished to find out that Americans should be able to have guns.
Supposedly so. According to Mr. Bogus, living up to his name.
That's just ridiculous. I mean, every man Madison would have known would have owned a gun. Possibly more than one, obviously.
They probably would have shown them off to their friends.
Yeah. Well, they would, because
it was fun.
Well, no, they had to be part of a militia that was going to fight off the British. Every single one of them would have had a rifle.
No, they were fighting off Haitians. That's obviously what they were doing.
This is preposterous.
15 years before the matter, Haitians were coming over in boats and assaulting the White House. This is the only explanation.
Okay, yeah.
But he says it's a mystery book about why James Madison decided to write the Second Amendment. Once again, we have the Federalist Papers.
We know his explicit thoughts.
Down because there is no direct evidence about what the founders intended. I can't read that with a straight face. Can you believe someone would say this when we have not just the Federalist Papers, but detailed journals from each of these? I want Bo to speak to this man.
But look at this next line. His agenda is clear. Instead of the Minuteman at Lexington with the musket in his hands, the more accurate image of the Second Amendment is that of the musket in the hands of the militiaman on a slave patrol in the South. That's just not true. The mystery supposedly reveals itself in the Virginia Ratification Convention of 1788 without spelling it out in so many words, Bogus writes. Right.
Without
saying this. Yeah. Right, okay.
Patrick Henry objected to an exclusive federal power over the militia because it would subvert the slave system indirectly. Once again, not in explicit words, just you have to infer this.
Yeah, well, I mean, if
body
he doesn't
language and winks and eye twitches, I assume.
If he doesn't actually say that, what's he quoting there?
I don't know. George Mason's warning that the disarming of the militia could lead to tyranny was actually a ruse. There were such were encoded discussions about slave control, Bogus speculates, that could not be made directly
Right.
because public discussion of it was often frowned upon.
I doubt it.
I don't think it was.
Yeah.
So this is all just nonsense.
They just invented the N-word.
What happened was all of these people were obviously telepathically communicating and decided never to write it down.
Just nudging
This is
and
about
winking.
slaves, right? Nudge, nudge, wink,
Yeah.
wink, eh? How's your father? Who's your missus? And then we got to more stupid, but slightly more honest arguments about this, about what it's all really about, which is just people going, I hate the Second Amendment because it's smelly poopy pants.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
That's what this all comes down to, really.
Yeah, but I respect this a lot more, right? Being like, look, I just don't value the right of Englishmen or their descendants to own self-defense.
Or even other people, because the Second Amendment doesn't just apply to the Englishmen's descendants.
Sure, but like, you know, that this is the sort of like the English ethos that America was founded upon. It's like, look, I don't like that because I hate it, says Kirk Swearingen, presumably a Scandinavian origin.
Possibly.
But okay, fine. At least make the argument. You know, at least you're going to be like, I don't agree with this for progressive reasons. Okay, fine.
I mean, this one's still pretty bad faith because it just accuses anyone who likes guns in the first line of being gun fetishists.
Based.
I mean, fair play, you know, okay. Then we got an even sillier argument in the next one, which is the classic. Gun violence is actually worse in red states. And do not impose this particular map over other maps of the United States because it might give you results that you're not particularly happy with.
Well, I bet it's a lot more concentrated around Democrat-run cities.
Why? You've predicted my next point, which is, yes, if it's red states, it isn't necessarily red cities, though, is it?
Yes.
Like, if we go to the next one, Connor sent me this Wirepoint survey. I think he covered it over the weekend, but sadly we couldn't include that particular weekend segment for some reason. But in this one, it just says Chicago, New Orleans, all of the blue states were all the murder capitals of the United States in 2022. I mean, listen to this figure right here.
Go on.
Just 90 minutes into the new year came Chicago's first criminal homicide of 2023. I mean, I'm not particularly surprised. It was probably in the South Side.
They have about 40 shootings a weekend and about somewhere between like 10 and 20 deaths. Like every weekend. It just happens in Chicago.
All, I'm sure, with registered firearms, which is why we see all of the articles going on about how it's registered firearms that commit all of these crimes.
Which is precisely why people in rural Alabama aren't allowed to own guns to protect themselves from bears.
Makes perfect sense to me. I don't know if they have bears in Alabama.
No, I have no idea.
But anyway.
They've got probably like mountain lions and stuff.
Yeah. And
sorry, it's down to wrestling them now.
I mean, you'll be more manly if you manage to win, but you're probably not going to win. And then Connor sent me this other article, which is the other side of the gun debate, because everybody always talks about gun violence, gun crimes, etc., etc. But a lot of people don't really talk about the thing that they're all there for, which is, okay, how many defensive gun uses are there every year? And this is an interesting article from 2018 in Forbes talking about the CDC basically hiding this information.
Oh, really?
From the US. So there was an article there was a study they did in 2013, ordered by the CDC, conducted by the National Academies Institute of Medicine and National Research Council, and reported that defensive use of guns by crime victims is a common occurrence. Almost all the national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008.
How many times were firearms used in 2008 to put down slave uprisings?
I don't think very many.
Right, okay. So it seems that even if the Second Amendment was designed to hold down the slaves, it still has a practical use in the modern day.
Certainly it seems that way. But that's not the part that they hid. So the person conducting all of this research and looking into these CDC surveys found that in the 1990s, they had previously unpublished results from CDCs, where they were talking about things like the number of defensive gun uses had probably increased since the 1990s because it's just gone up with the population and such, but it does mean that guns have even more practical utility, especially as hostile populations are managing to get over the border and such.
Got MS-13 running around, I'd probably want a gun.
Yes, absolutely. And they say Number 3, when they're going through all this information, they say, we don't know why the CDC chose not to publish the data from the 1990s. Kleck offers some ideas in his original paper. One possible explanation was that something or other, but another factor might also have played a role in the decision of the CDC personnel to not report these defensive gun use findings. For the CDC's own surveys to generate high estimates of defensive gun use prevalence was clearly not helpful to efforts to enact stricter controls over firearms, since it implies that some such measures might disarm people who otherwise would have been able to use a gun for self-protection, such as a Kyle Rittenhouse. Yep. For instance, they don't want a Kyle Rittenhouse. They don't want you to be able to defend yourself when the BLM hordes come knocking at your door.
Was Gage Groskrautz's gun registered?
I'd be very surprised if it had been. But of course, he wasn't the one on trial.
No, that's true.
No, he wasn't the one on trial, despite
he was just trying to kill him.
Yeah, he was, and he admitted as much,
he
basically.
literally just holding the gun.
And they even say here, this is very interesting, one CDC official in the 1990s openly told the Washington Post that his goal was to create a public perception of gun ownership as something dirty, deadly, and banned. Given that history, I can't dismiss Kleck's critique, and that was the critique.
Well done on the American gun owners for resisting that, then.
Yes, absolutely. So there it is. They're just saying it out loud. They want to take your guns, and there are people within all of these institutions that have been completely subverted and want to present a facsimile of reality that means that you think guns are far more dangerous, only ever used for violent crimes and crimes against normal people, only ever used to murder people, when in fact, most of their use tends to be against criminals who are aggressing on somebody else, which is the explicit intended use of the Second Amendment as stated by the initial people who wrote it, not in fact for preventing slave uprisings, which nobody can provide any real proof that that's what the original intention was.
And even then, it's not really something we have to worry about in the modern day.
No, shockingly enough. But remember, keep your guns close, folks.
We hope you enjoyed that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you did enjoy, you can go to our website and get the podcast in full for free, and also pay as little as £5 a month to get access to all of our premium content and help us keep the lights on. Series such as mine and Harry's Comics Corner, where in this episode we took a look at the first part of Berserk, that is the Black Swordsman and Golden Age arc, with the second part to come. If you'd like to find out all the rest of the content that we're putting out, you can follow us at LotusEaters_com on Twitter and on Getter. Until next time, goodbye.